Now your pitch curve is really going to be a personal preference. I tend to have a very flat in my normal pitch curve setting. I'm doing somewhat hovering. I want to be able to move the stick and not have the pitch jump up and down, so I can have a smooth hover. And also in idle up 1, I've got some negative pitch coming in. So when I got the stick, since I've set up so that 50% is zero pitch, then if I see anything on the out value of less than 50%, that means that's going to be negative. So in my idle up 1, somewhere between a quarter, probably like a third of the stick, that's where I'm hitting the zero pitch. Sometimes I can use idle up 1 for hovering around too. Basic forward flight, maybe some loops, a little bit of rolls. As long as I got some speed, you can use this kind of a curve for your idle up 1. But really, this curve, you're going to want to look at your pitch gauge for your max pitch, where you want it. I tend to have a +9 to like a -4, -5 range for my idle up 1. And a pretty linear, for the most part, curve is what I like. It's not perfectly linear. It's a little smoother in the positive direction, a little sharper in the negative direction. That's just a personal preference. And for your idle up 2, basically the pitch curve, I've got it perfectly linear. So at 50% stick, that's my zero pitch. I always make sure that, once again, 50% stick, 50% output is going to be my zero pitch, and then it's linear to about a +9 and -9 pitch curve on there. That way, when I'm flying inverted, hovering inverted, it should be as smooth as when I'm hovering right side up. Doing flip-flops, everything's pretty linear. You don't want sudden jumps in the pitch. That's why I sort of have it there linear like that. Your throttle curves are really going to be adjusted so that you're trying to attain as close to consistent head speed as possible. Some people have some preferences where, when they're closer to neutral, that they want a higher RPM as much as they can, and so forth. What I've got here is, as I'm ramping up in the throttle, I tend to move slowly at the stick to bring it to speed. Then it's got a little bit, it's a little flatter in here where I'm hovering to match the pitch curve that I have. And no matter what I set up here, once I get it out in the field for the first flight of this helicopter, I'm going to be tweaking with that throttle curve to try to get my head speed as consistent as possible when I'm, say, hovering or climbing and so forth. I don't want it to bog down in a climb, especially when you're doing 3D and so forth. You don't want it to be bogging down as you're giving it maximum pitch. And throttle curve for idle up 1, since I've got some negative going on towards the bottom, and my zero pitch is somewhere between, let's say, 1 and 2, something like that. That's when I had the least amount of throttle. Once again, say right here it's 58%. I might end up having to bump that up higher, depending upon how the Heli is flying. No electronic speed control is exactly the same as another. They're usually pretty close, but there's always some tweaking that gets involved when setting up the throttle curves. And over here with my 3D setting, idle up, you can see I've got that D curve going on, and at the bottom it's at about 50%, 54%. It looks like their output for the throttle. I might even bump that up just to start out. I don't particularly want to be over revving too much on the first flight, so I've got it pretty flat. There are some people who might when they're doing 3D, they want a lot of RPMs, especially around neutral, so that when they're at neutral they can flip over really fast, and they might set up their throttle to be like 80% or 90%. I've seen that happen. Once again, that's a personal preference for some people. Revo mix or revolution mixing. Since for the most part when I take off, I'm using the heading hold mode. I leave all the Revo mix turned off. You can use that in rate mode. In some cases, in some helicopters that I've had where I only had a single rate gyro, I've just flown the tail and I've left the rebo mix alone. If you have like a fixed pitch helicopter, you might want to be using something like this, but in this helicopter with a heading hold gyro, you're just going to want to leave the rebo mix alone. And it's really nice when you got a radio with a built-in timer. If you do not have a radio with a built-in timer, then what I highly suggest is to go and get some kind of a timer that you can attach to the radio or have available so that you can time your flight. When hovering around, I might set a timer value of 8 minutes. When doing forward flight or sort of 3D type of maneuvers, I'll typically set it to about 6. You're going to have to really experiment with your flying style, and what I advise a lot of people, especially at the very beginning, is to measure the individual cell voltage of their battery. You should probably look up, there's usually some charts available online for what your static voltage is and how much capacity is left. In general, if you finish your flight and you measure across the cells of your battery pack, 3.6 volts, something like that, you've pretty much depleted that battery. 3.6 volts per cell is pretty much depleted. So you want to always give yourself a little bit of room. The electronic speed control on this helicopter will limit your throttle, and you'll really feel the power sag when it's time to land. Especially at the very beginning, you don't want to be doing a lot of inverted flight towards the end of your pack. In the very beginning, probably do some hovering, feel it out, do some forward flight, and towards the end of your forward flight, come in, do some more hovering, and when you start to feel that you got to start moving that stick up, it's time to come in and land the helicopter before you have no more time to land. I do fly with a little bit of exponential on my sticks, typically 15 to 25% on this radio. And this particular radio, in order to make it so that moving the stick a lot moves the servo a little near the centers, to make the center so it's not jumpy, helps with the hovering and so forth, you give it a positive plus 25%. So you want to have a little bit of a bend in this direction to that little graph. That's one of the things I really like about the Spektrum DX7 is little graphs and so forth. It kind of explains things for you, where you're moving the servo versus the output. For example, I've got a Futabas radio, and for that particular radio I fly negative exponential. It's actually the same effect, it's just on that particular radio it says negative versus on this one it says positive. On the DX7 you can set up dual rate so that you can flip a switch, and then you can make it so that you've got, say, more throws when you're doing forward flight, depending upon the flip of the switch. That's really cool. I don't tend to do that. I think there's enough things to think about in terms of flipping switches and so forth. I just don't tend to use the auto dual rates, and I used to, but just don't use dual rates anymore. I just get used to flying one way, and that's it. I asked a Heli mentor of mine many years ago, I said, what's the best advice for a beginner? What can you tell me that's really good advice? And he said, the most important advice is take all the advice that you get with a grain of salt.